Welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Wars, revolts, revolutions, occupations, and regime change are among the most important elements that are making and remaking our world today. Is there any logic or design behind these upheavals? Is the world order of today the one that was expected with the end of the Cold War? And is the West a force for positive change? To crosstalk the new world disorder, I'm joined by Ryan Moreau in New York. He is the national security analyst of RadicalIslam.org and a fellow at the Clarion Fund. Also in New York, we have George Samouli. He is a fellow at the Global Policy Institute of the London Metropolitan University. And in Austin, we cross to Alan Kuperman. He is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. A few days ago, Pat Buchanan wrote an article that got a lot of attention. He said what is driving the world today is sectarianism, tribalism, and nationalism. And he talks about democracy, which we'll mention later. Ryan, what do you think about that?
I think that's very true, that you are seeing an increasing sectarian conflict in the Middle East, not just in Syria, but also between Iran with the radical Shiites and then the Saudis, the radical Sunnis. But there's also an ideological conflict that's going on within the Islamic world between the Islamists that want Sharia-based governance and then the non-Islamists who want to bring their world into a more 21st century type outlook, and that's more democratic and peaceful in nature.
Okay, George, what do you think about that? I mean, I don't hear any history there. Go ahead, George.
Yes, I don't find that the analysis is quite right. Because I don't think that these sectarian conflicts are innate. I think these sectarian conflicts have been willed into existence. And I think that what has happened has been that the West, chiefly the United States, has gone out of its way to foster disorder. And out of disorder comes sectarianism. Because what happens when you demonize and then destroy a government is that your society disintegrates. People rally around whoever is going to defend them, whether it's tribal leaders or clans or local warlords or gangsters. So I don't think that there's some inherent sectarianism. I think the sectarianism has been willed into existence largely by the policies of the United States. Okay,
where do you want to jump in on that, Alan?
Well, I would disagree with George. I think that ethno-national sectarian differences, rivalries, and conflicts are inherent. Where the West and the international community have a role is that they can, if there is a leader, they can help contain those things. But look, you know, the conflicts that you're talking about go well beyond the Middle East. Look at East Asia. We have China and Japan in rivalries, Japan and South Korea in rivalries, China disputing islands with the Philippines and Vietnam. That's not because of U.S. meddling or anything like that. That's inherent in international politics, especially when you don't have a strong leader. And what we've seen from the United States is really, in some ways, a lack of strong leadership to help contain those conflicts. And sometimes, George is correct, we've actually engaged in incorrect strategies and policies that have exacerbated conflicts.
Okay, there was a lot said right there.
Yeah, but I think it's wrong to say that.
Ryan, go ahead, jump in. This is Crosstalk. Go ahead, Ryan, jump in.
Yeah, I think it's completely wrong to think that the U.S. wants, for example, Sunnis and Shiites to just kill each other like in Iraq. That happened on its own. It partially happened because of incorrect strategy, but that was a decision made by radical Sunnis and radical Shiites on their own, and the U.S. engaged in the surge in Iraq partially to put an end to that. So I think that it's absurd to think that the U.S. wants this type of conflict to happen.
Well, George, what do you think about that? Because the conflict, these sectarian differences actually promote American foreign policy and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar.
Yes, I think, yeah, well, that's it, exactly. Sectarian differences lead to the destruction of states. I mean, where before you had an Iraq that was a serious state and a reasonably powerful state, now we have the Kurdistan, which is virtually seceded. We have the Shia and Sunnis, which are in almost daily conflict with each other. This has come about as a result of U.S. policy. I mean, U.S. policymakers aren't stupid. I mean, it didn't come as a complete surprise to them that this was what would happen once the United States invaded. The same thing has happened now following Libya. I mean, we've already seen the spillover effect in Mali. I mean, again, this was always likely once the United States aligned itself with the various radical Islamic forces, the very groups that it had already listed as terrorist organizations. And the same thing is clearly happening in Syria. We've seen that the civil war, which has been clearly fueled and funded and financed by the United States, is now spilled over into Lebanon. And as this war continues, as it will do, Lebanon will almost certainly be engulfed in a further civil war. So I think these are policies that great powers, particularly the United States, will into existence because they weaken possible opponents.
Okay, Alan, what do you think about that? It works to America's advantage and its allies to have these sectarian differences, particularly in looking at Syria and the region.
Well, on the one hand, I think Ryan is right that the U.S. doesn't deliberately want there to be this sectarian conflict. But on the other hand, the U.S. has other strategic goals, and the way it pursues them actually exacerbates and fuels sectarian conflict. So when the U.S. looks at a place like Syria, they see Bashar al-Assad's regime, they see it allied with Iran. Iran is our enemy, and so we really want that guy to go. But in trying to will that to happen, what we wind up doing is helping the opposition with non-lethal aid, with intelligence, helping other countries that are giving lethal aid. And what that does is fuel a big sectarian civil war in Syria that's now spilling over into Lebanon, spilling into Turkey, spilling into Iraq, and creating disorder. And my initial criticism of U.S. policy at the beginning of the show is that what a great power should do is try and promote stability above all else, because instability hurts a country's national interest, it hurts civilians, non-combatants, creates humanitarian emergencies, creates contagious civil war. That's where I fault the U.S. government right now for not taking a leadership role to promote stability. Instead, what they're doing is sowing instability. It's very short-sighted, it's very dangerous.
Well, I mean, Ryan, this instability is working for the United States. They want to get rid of the regime in Iran. Okay, this is the end game, isn't it? So instability works.
I think it depends. You want instability if you're unhappy with the status quo. If you're happy with the status quo, like we were in Egypt, then you don't look upon things like revolutions very kindly. But in terms of what's happened in Libya and Syria, the U.S. was late in the game to getting involved there. I think that's incorrect to blame the U.S. solely for what's happening in those countries. The U.S. very reluctantly got involved, and we're still not fully involved. And look at how long it took President Obama to call on Bashar Assad to resign. He was criticized heavily by the Syrian opposition for that. In fact, the Syrian opposition continues to criticize the U.S.
It didn't take very long at all. It didn't take. It's over a year ago that they called for Bashar al-Assad to step down. That's incorrect, right? So the point is not just that, if the U.S. doesn't engage in a big way, that doesn't mean the U.S. isn't at fault.
No,
I'm sorry?
I do think. Sorry, I do think that's incorrect, because, if you remember, there was Seymour Hersh wrote a long article in the New Yorker in 2007. It was in 2007 that the Bush administration has targeted the Syrian regime for removal. And it detailed how, working with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and with various radical Islamic forces, they intended to destroy the regime of Bashar Assad. This was in 2007 that Seymour Hersh wrote this article, and what we've seen is the fulfillment of that policy. So it's not true to say that somehow they got into this game very late. No, they got into this game extremely early.
The U.S. was meeting with Syrian opposition activists of different kinds. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood was involved in that coalition, but they're also meeting with defectors that were in Europe, and it didn't look like there were a lot of resources put behind that. In fact, again, the Syrian opposition disagrees with that analysis that the U.S. was fully behind them. In fact, if you listen to what the Free Syrian Army is saying, is that the U.S. is betraying the American dream. The U.S. says that stands for freedom and human rights, yet they're letting us be massacred.
Alan, go ahead.
But Ryan, that's the whole problem, right?
Yeah, that is the whole problem. Alan, jump in.
you know, the U.S. could do three things, right? It could stay out of the Syrian conflict and let the Syrian regime just control the country. That would be promoting stability. Or it could come in with a big leadership role, with a big intervention, overthrow the regime, install a new regime. Okay, and that would at least protect civilians. But instead, what the U.S. has done is the worst of both worlds, right? It has said Assad has to step down, and therefore what that does is just embolden the rebels and fuel the civil war, but it's not doing anything to actually help the rebels win or to defeat Assad. So all it's done is throw fuel on the fire. If you want to say that that's not the U.S. taking a big role, I would disagree. The U.S. has played a huge role in Syria. It has emboldened, it has escalated the civil war, but it hasn't done anything to rein it in. That's the worst of both worlds.
Okay, Ryan, when you look at all these interventions, when does it go right? When do these interventions go right for the United States and the West? Give me one example.
I think Libya went well.
Okay. George, do you want to talk about Libya?
Well, I don't see how one can think that things have gone well in Libya. When we look at the situation now, there is no government there. I mean, essentially, it's just local militia, you know, running their neighborhoods. There's, you know, even when it comes to the trial of Gaddafi's son, I mean, the central government is unable even to bring the man into custody. The other day, there was news stories about these Sufi Muslim monuments that were destroyed. So, you know, it's gone well for the United States, and that the United States suffered minimal casualties. NATO suffered minimal casualties. For the victims of the NATO bombs, I don't think it's gone well at all.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the New World Order. Stay. Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Laveau. To remind you, we're talking about what is changing the world today. Okay, Alan, I'd like to go back to you in Austin. You wanted to remark on what George had to say about the relative success or failure of the Libyan intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm going to a conference actually this week and talking about Libya, and I would say the intervention was a failure not only on humanitarian grounds, but also on strategic grounds. On humanitarian grounds, at the time of the intervention, when it started, there were only 1,000 dead Libyans from the conflict. And by the time the intervention ended, 8 months later, there was something on the order of 10 to 40,000 dead Libyans. So the intervention, which was supposed to save lives, actually cost lives. And if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, it's potentially even worse. This intervention in Libya caused the overthrow of the government in neighboring Mali, and now the northern half of Mali is occupied by Islamic extremists that are allied with Al-Qaeda, and this is now seeping into neighboring Niger. So we went from a country in Libya that was actually our ally at the time, and now who knows what Libya is going to be, and the neighboring countries are now our enemies. So it's a disaster. But you asked, are there any interventions that work? And actually, I was in Liberia this summer doing research. That's one of the few interventions that actually worked. And you probably don't even remember it. It's 2003. And the reason you don't remember it is that there were only about 200 U.S. troops in the country for about 2 weeks. And what really worked there was diplomacy. And that's the element that the Obama administration seems to have forgotten in Syria. They just think that by aiding the rebels, encouraging the rebels, condemning the government, that everything's going to just wind up fine. And it doesn't. It takes hard work. It takes hard diplomacy. Okay, Ryan, if I can go back, we can change the subject slightly here. Sure. I mean, you said that the United States should lead, but maybe the international order should change. I mean, why should the United States always be leading? Okay, the Cold War is over. Okay, we have a different world order coming into being, but the United States still wants to lead. Maybe it should change.
Well, personally, I'm not willing to let people be massacred while we wait for that world order to arise. We should definitely work with international partners, but I don't think that we should wait on the United Nations when you have Russia and China on the UN Security Council to get stuff done. As for Libya, you have to consider the fact of how many Libyans were going to die absent that intervention. I mean, the conflict wasn't going to just end.
The war was over, Ryan. The war was over. The rebels had been defeated.
Gaddafi.
No more Libyans were going to be killed.
No, they were about to be massacred in Benghazi, and I don't think it would have ended there. I really don't.
Let me ask you a question, Ryan. If no Libyans
Gaddafi's
had been
forces were
massacred in
stopped
any of the
outside of
other
Benghazi.
cities,
That's a fact.
Go ahead, Alan. Ask your question again, Alan. Go ahead. Go ahead.
If Gaddafi's forces had not massacred Libyan civilians in any of the other cities that they recaptured, why would they have massacred civilians in the last city, Benghazi? That was not going to happen. That was propaganda by the rebels to get the West to intervene. And you know what? It worked. They played us for patsies.
You want to reply to that, Ryan?
No, I think if you look at the human rights abuses by Gaddafi's forces, where they said they were going to hunt down every rebel in every closet in Benghazi, I mean, Gaddafi was a madman. There was going to be a massacre,
Ryan,
but there's one other point that
very interesting.
You know,
Ryan, it's very interesting that you listened to Gaddafi once. You took him seriously once, okay? He had a long history of saying crazy things. George, jump in.
He wasn't crazy about killing his own
I would say
people.
exactly.
That wasn't crazy
just
talk,
because he says something that, in terms of rhetorical overkill, NATO intervenes. But in fact, I mean, with all of these interventions, I'm not just talking about Libya, the United States neglected any kind of diplomacy because it was very anxious to intervene. I mean, we saw this in Kosovo and before that in Bosnia, precisely again, wild talks of massacres and genocide and so on, and in order to justify a U.S. intervention. So the Obama administration in Syria and in Libya has neglected diplomacy, but it's continuing in a long tradition of United States favoring military solutions rather than diplomatic ones.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Alan, if I can go to you, I mean, the whole issue of democracy isn't talked a whole lot about now because I guess it's inconvenient, but Bahrain was a country that actually was, people were protesting for more democracy. And then the United States chooses a side in Syria that we have no idea whatsoever if they're democratic or not. As a matter of fact, they have a lot of unsavory elements attached to them. So what about democracy?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. There's a certain amount of hypocrisy, and countries will always pursue the national interest first, and so, you know, it's the enemy of our enemy is the strategy, and so we don't like Assad in Syria because he's allied with Iran, but on the other side in Bahrain, it's the opposition that's Shiite and therefore allied with Iran. So in that case, we support the government crackdown quietly. But I'd like to get to your other point, Peter. Your overarching question was, why does the U.S. have to play a leadership role? You know, why does the U.S. have to lead? And I would argue the U.S. actually does have to lead. This is probably an area where we disagree. I think you always have to have somebody leading the international community because it's hard. It's hard to organize countries. It's like, for example, in Syria, we would have to get Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, all to agree on a concerted policy, and that doesn't happen just naturally. Somebody has to take the lead role, and only the United States can do it. And if the United States decides to recede from the international stage, to lead from behind in this oxymoronic Obama strategy, then what we're going to see is what we're seeing, for example, in East Asia, where without the U.S. being there providing stability, now all the other countries are going to be fighting for their interests. And it's going to be China versus Japan versus South Korea versus Philippines versus Vietnam. We don't need to relive the 20th century in East Asia.
George, you want to jump in on that?
Well, if I could disagree with that, I really don't think that you can have a stable world order with one power leading. It's never been the case in the past. And when the United Nations was set up after World War II, the idea was to have a consensus of the great powers, hence the permanent members of the Security Council. The moment the United States decides, well, we're just going to
how did that work with the League of Nations? How did that work with the League of Nations, George?
Well, the League of Nations didn't work because the leading powers, England and France, were simply not strong enough to impose their world order. You remember Germany and the Soviet Union were pretty much out of the League of Nations, and England and France by themselves, and the United States was also out of it, England and France were really too weak to impose a world order.
But this is my point. If you don't have a leader, then you're not going to get concerted action, and you're going to get chaos. That's why you need a leader. You might not like the United States, you might think that the United States is neo-imperial, but it's better to have order than disorder.
George, you want to reply?
There is, yes, I agree that there should be order, but the only way that you can have order is by a consensus of the great powers, and therefore respecting the rights and prerogatives of the great powers, and not to do things that clearly antagonize them and ensure that they will always be in opposition. The United States just simply doesn't have the resources to
let decide our
world.
foreign policy, though.
Go ahead, Ryan, jump in.
I'm just interested to know what great powers, as he called it, he feels should decide our foreign policy if we have to work with this giant consensus that he's advocating.
Well, Russia and China are permanent members of the Security Council. They are huge nations. They are massive nuclear superpowers. Clearly their rights and prerogatives have to be respected. Nobody's saying that Russia should decide U.S. foreign policy, but if you are going to create a world order, then you do need the consensus of the great powers. And so therefore there has to be some agreement among these giant powers that in their regions, this is how things will be. One can't just have one power deciding, well, we're going to have these powers in NATO, we're going to overthrow governments here, and we're just going to ignore you except when we come to United Nations, the Security Council, and try and get a resolution going. That's a recipe for failure.
Okay, I want to change gears. Alan, I'd like to go back to you. I think it's quite interesting here is that you mentioned the Pacific and North Asia, which I think is correct, and we were talking about the greater Middle East. Are we seeing the map being redrawn or going back to the way it used to be when we look at sectarian differences and all that? Because so many countries in the world are artificial. Their borders are artificial and were decided by outside powers. Do you see that unraveling, given sectarian differences, tribal differences?
Well, I hope not. One of the great sources of stability and order in the world is that there's been this norm that you simply are not allowed to change borders by force. And as you point out, the ethnic and national demography does not match exactly the territorial borders in places like Africa, in Asia, in many parts of the world, in Europe even. And so if we get rid of that norm of these fixed borders, then we're in big trouble. I'm not sure that that's the big issue. What I see is that there are disputes over resources, especially oil in East Asia, and then there are these historical animosities. What Japan did in China in the 1930s is absolutely reprehensible. If I were Chinese, I would carry a grudge against Japan. I would be very leery of Japan, and I might even seek vengeance. And so you have this terrible mix of dispute over resources plus these resentments from the past, justified resentments. And that is a very, very dangerous mix. And that's why I've always felt that the U.S. plays a stabilizing role in East Asia. It says we are the strongest power here. We provide security. You don't have to worry about your security. We're not going to let you get revenge for your past wrongs. And so if the U.S. were to recede from that stage, then I think what you're talking about could happen. We could go back to the future, as the movie used to say, and we could start seeing these countries try to resolve their anger and their resource disputes on their own, and that's a recipe for war, and that would just be horrible.
Okay, but George, if I can go to you, the borders that have been settled in the 20th century, they were settled by the great powers, the Western powers for the most part. I mean, no wonder some people want to change them now.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the borders that were established after World War I didn't survive because England and France were simply not strong enough to ensure that they would survive. And once Germany decided that they didn't want those borders, then that was that. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were strong enough to say that there'd be no border changes. But the most serious border change that taken place since World War II took place in Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was clearly a case of where border changes took place.
Okay, George, we're going to have to talk about border changes in another program. Thank you, gentlemen. Many thanks today to my guests in New York and in Austin. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.